Take this debt and shove it, and the dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials, and the Millennial joining me today is, of course, Christopher Hopkins, our producer. And I want to welcome you to this podcast, and the podcast is called Take This Debt and Shove It. And, of course, the dumbest bill in America. And why are we saying take this debt and shove it? Because House Republicans are refusing to sign on to lifting the debt ceiling. So when you spend a lot of money in the United States Congress and you don't have enough tax revenue coming in to pay for the spending, you need to borrow. And the United States government has been borrowing way too much money for far too long. It's one of the reasons we have inflation. There are many reasons, but that is one of the principal reasons. And we have the Democrats wanting to spend $4.5 trillion. But before they can pass that spending bill, they need to lift the debt ceiling. That is to say, they need to have a vote to raise the amount of debt that the United States is allowed to be encumbered by. And so House Republicans have vowed to vote against increasing the debt ceiling. And so in the New York Post, we have over 100 Republicans in the House of Representatives are vowing in a new letter that they will not vote to increase the debt ceiling, calling the issue a problem created by Democrat spending. I'm going to stop there for a minute because I'm just curious. When was the last time, podcast listeners, that you heard of a Democrat complaining about the fact that they had to vote to lift the debt ceiling? When was the last time you heard a Democrat talk about fiscal responsibility, the idea that we are just borrowing way too much money and saying, you know what, I'm going to put my foot down here. I'm drawing the line in the sand and I'm not going to vote to lift the debt ceiling. When was the last time you heard a member of the House of Representatives say that who happened to be a Democrat? Like never. I mean, out of every single member in the House of Representatives who is Democrat, I bet you if you were to poll every single one of them, you'd probably find that not a single one would support that. Citing trillions of dollars of government spending proposed by Democrats, the 103 House Republicans promised not to increase the debt ceiling under any circumstance, according to the letter obtained by Fox News. Democrats have embarked on a massive and unprecedented deficit spending spree. Without a single Republican vote, they passed a $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill in March, even though $1 trillion was still unspent from the previous bipartisan COVID relief bills. So the Democrats are so sick with spending, and this is a mental health issue of spending. And they don't seem to have any connection to what the reality of the spending is going to cause, not just future generations, but current Americans with respect to inflation. They went ahead and passed a $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill in March, even though $1 trillion from the last COVID relief bill hadn't even been spent yet. Because remember, it takes a lot of effort for these federal agencies to dole out this money in the way that Congress has appropriated it and spent it. And so you then have to raise the debt ceiling to raise the money necessary. And then once you raise the money necessary, because you're selling, of course, debt to foreign countries and private individuals and so forth, once you raise that money, then you have to get the money in the bank, so to speak, and then the federal agencies have to dole that money out in accordance with what the COVID relief bills have said. So $1 trillion hasn't even been spent yet from the previous bipartisan COVID relief bills. That's what the letter said. And also citing the recently passed $3.5 trillion budget resolution. Quote, in order for this spending to occur, our nation's debt limit will have to be increased significantly. It continued, because Democrats are responsible for the spending. They need to take responsibility for increasing the debt ceiling. Well, of course. And as I said, there isn't going to be a single Democrat who's going to vote against increasing the debt ceiling. The Republicans, led by Representatives Kevin Hern, who's a Republican from Oklahoma, and Jim Banks, Republican from Indiana, vowed they will not increase the debt ceiling if it comes through a standalone bill, a continuing resolution, or any other vehicle. Earlier this month, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican Kentucky, warned Democrats that they should not expect any GOP support in raising the debt ceiling after calling the $3.5 trillion infrastructure bill their latest socialist shopping list. In just a few days, our colleagues will start ramming through yet another reckless taxing and spending spree, trillions more in inflationary spending when families just want good jobs and stable prices. But there's something funny happening, McConnell said. Even as Democrats crow about how all the spending is so good and so needed, they're petrified to vote for the credit limit increase that would make it possible. In other words, the Democrats can't wait to vote for the $4.5 trillion in additional spending, which of course is just an ungodly amount of money. Yet they don't necessarily want to have to vote to raise the debt ceiling to borrow the money to pay for the spending. What they want to do is get Republicans along with them to vote for this debt ceiling lift. And that way they can say, well, it's really bipartisan. You know, we're all in this together to borrow all of this money. And actually, it's not. Democrats are about to tell Republicans to go take a hike and start teeing up trillions more dollars and borrowing and spending without a single Republican vote. But at the same time, they're extolling the virtues of their latest socialist shopping list. They are afraid to up the limit on their credit card. That's right. So what they want to do is take their credit card with a $1,000 limit and spend $10,000, but they don't want to call the credit card company and ask for permission to increase their credit limit. They just want to go ahead and do it. On July, and they also don't want to look internally to see if they can actually repay that money, or at least determine how long it will take them to repay that money. On July 31st, the 2-year suspension on the debt ceiling expired. Democrats have been weighing attaching the debt ceiling to a sweeping spending bill this fall, forcing Republicans to get on board. We should not default on our debts under any circumstances, the GOP letter added. If Democrats threaten a default, it will only be because they refuse to vote for the debt ceiling increase necessitated by their own irresponsible spending. Democrats at any time have the power through reconciliation to unilaterally raise the debt ceiling, and they should not be allowed to pretend otherwise. Monday's letter comes as Democrats attempt to pass the budget resolution while facing a number of hurdles due to their razor-thin majorities in both chambers, with moderates expressing concerns about the price tag and progressives pushing for numerous controversial provisions to be included in the final reconciliation packages. And we've said already before, there are no moderates. I mean, the moderates in the House of Representatives who are Democrats are people who are moderates only because they're terrified they're going to lose their next election if they don't try to sound like they're moderates. But at the end of the day, if their district changed to be more progressive, which is really what they would like, that's exactly how they would prefer to vote. There aren't moderate Democrats. They're all progressives. They're all socialists. And if they weren't socialists, then why in the hell would they be forcing everyone to pass $4.5 trillion of more spending when there's already $1 trillion of spending that still was passed but hasn't even been spent yet? Last night, the budget's blueprint was passed 220 to 212 after House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Democrat of California, convinced 10 Republicans to support the bill's framework, while the massive spending bill has yet to be written. Last week's vote allows Democrats to move forward. Well, we should find out who those 10 Republicans are, because clearly they need to take Econ 101 and describe to everybody how in the heck it is they are going to figure out how to repay all of this money. And that's why we're calling this podcast Take This Debt and Shove It, because Republicans are finally taking a unified stance and a unified stand against lifting the debt ceiling and talking about conservative values, which is fiscal responsibility. And why is fiscal responsibility needed? Well, because there's a new article out in the Wall Street Journal about how Social Security is back in the news again because of the issue of what? Solvency. Social Security costs expected to exceed the total income in 2021 as COVID-19 takes financial toll. Now, I'm sure all of you out there in podcast land think that when you have the Social Security monies taken from your check every pay period, that it's going to some sort of account, some sort of savings account, some sort of investment account, some sort of lockbox that no one can touch. It's not. It's not. It's being spent as soon as it is received. In fact, it was probably spent a long time ago, and they haven't even received it yet, which is the problem with, of course, the $4.5 trillion of additional spending, let alone much of the other spending that has taken place by Republicans, by the way, and Democrats alike. But Social Security costs are expected to exceed total income in 2021 as COVID-19 takes financial toll. In other words, people weren't able to work, and if you're not able to work, then you can't take Social Security money out of someone's check if they're not getting a check. So that, of course, makes it difficult for Social Security to maintain its obligations of current retirees. Trustees say the hit from the pandemic was less than feared. However, it's still really bad. It's now expected to be depleted in 2034 unless Congress shores up the program. In other words, in about 12 years, it'll be insolvent. Social Security will be insolvent unless something happens, like we have a massive growing economy and some reforms are taking place as well. The severe economic downturn caused by the COVID-19 pandemic last year weighed on the financial health of Social Security, but not as much as many forecasters originally feared, according to new projections of the program's finances. Trustees for the Social Security Trust Fund, in an annual report released Tuesday, said the program is expected to pay benefits that exceed its income in 2021. In other words, this year alone, Social Security is going to send out more money than the money that is coming in. As anticipated last year at the outset of the pandemic. So they're saying, well, yeah, we knew this was going to happen, but, it's just the pandemic. And by the way, if the money were really put into a trust fund and a lockbox, then it would be impossible for there not to have enough money coming in, because all the other money that had been saved up over the many decades of people working prior to retirement would have been in a trust fund. But there is no trust fund. It's all bogus. While the pandemic had a significant impact on the program, the trustees said they expect Social Security's reserves to be depleted by 2034, only 1 year sooner than they estimated in their April 2020 report. Oh yeah, so we only have 1 year less before we're bankrupt. Once the reserves are exhausted, benefits would be reduced automatically unless Congress steps in to shore up the program, which lawmakers have done previously. Yeah, isn't that great? So if the program doesn't have enough money, then automatically what happens is you will, as a retiree, receive significantly less benefits. And so you say to yourself, well, wait a minute, I paid all this money in over 4 decades, maybe even 5 decades to Social Security. How is it possible that I'm getting less money? Because where is all the money that I paid into the system? Well, it's long since been spent. And this is what the Democrats are doing. They don't care. They don't care how much money they spend. They don't care that there's a $4.5 trillion spending bill. They don't care about the obligations of our generation and future generations to repay it. They don't care about retirees or very near the future retirees who may very well not have Social Security available to them or significantly reduced benefits available to them. If they cared about it, they would actually have a whole conversation about it. They would have a very thorough debate about what this spending really means. The trustees now project elevated mortality rates related to the pandemic through 2023 and expect lower immigration and childbearing this year and next compared with their 2020 estimates. So in other words, one of the things they're taking into consideration with Social Security, God, I can't believe I'm reading this, is that because of the pandemic, a lot of people died or are likely to die. And many of those people are, of course, older, and that saves Social Security money. Now, that's really kind of creepy because it makes you wonder sometimes about how things happen. But I'm not going to go there for now. We're going to just talk about the fiscal responsibility issue. They also expect the pandemic has lowered worker productivity and thus economic output permanently. I'm sure worker productivity has decreased because people aren't even showing up at the office. Quote, these alterations to near-term data and assumptions are all significantly impacting the outlook of the programs, the Social Security folks said. Senior administration officials also said they expect higher inflation this year will significantly boost benefits next year. So the spending policies of the Democrats are causing inflation. And that inflation automatically boosts Social Security benefits because you have to have a cost of living increase with Social Security because you're on a fixed income. And that fixed income from last year won't buy what it used to this year. So this year, you need to be paid more. And at the same time, they're running Social Security into the ground by the irresponsible spending. That would be the highest annual benefit increase since 2008, when rising gas prices pushed up the cost of living adjustments in Social Security to 5.8%. Can you imagine? Can you imagine trying to get, as someone on a fixed income, a 5.8% return on your investments? Because, you want super safe investments when you're in retirement. And a 5.8% return is very difficult to get when banks are paying less than 1% interest. So you have to put your money somewhere that's going to pay the 5.8% return annually, by the way, so that you can afford to live on that. And now we have the government doing this. The government is causing all of this mayhem through the spending. And the government specifically this time is completely and utterly controlled by Democrats at all levels of government. So they own this problem. They own it. And so good for the Republicans, at least, for saying, take this debt ceiling and shove it. We're not going to do this anymore. And hopefully Republicans, when they do get in charge, will actually engage in fiscal responsibility and reverse a lot of this spending. Because if we have $1 trillion that hasn't yet been spent, but is authorized to be spent by law, then hopefully out of this $4.5 trillion by the end of next year, when Republicans are in charge, that they'll be able to reverse a lot of the spending. And so maybe next year we'll be lucky and $3 trillion won't be spent. The Republicans will say, enough. We're not going to spend this money. We're going to reverse all those laws they passed. And for everybody on the gravy train hoping to get this free money for doing nothing, or, free money for green technologies, forget it. We're going to reverse it because it's not the function of government. We don't have the money. We must take care of our core responsibilities, not the least of which is Social Security and people on fixed incomes. So next up, podcast listeners, the Taliban is looking to expand its capabilities with the U.S. weaponry that was left behind. Interesting, huh? We were told that the weaponry that was left behind was not going to be useful for the Taliban because it was not in working order, or it was missing pieces, or we had done things to it to make it no longer work. I've seen a number, by the way, of stories on this, including on mainstream television. But meanwhile, the Taliban is looking to expand its capabilities with U.S. weaponry. And this goes to my central thesis, which I'm going to get to. I've mentioned it on the previous podcast, but I think now we're getting more details on this. Now, we the people are getting more details on how things went down in Afghanistan and why they did. Doesn't mean we have to agree with it, but certainly I think that my theory a few podcasts ago, I think it's proving to be true. So here it is in the Wall Street Journal. Taliban is seeking to expand their capabilities with the U.S. weaponry that was left behind. A group claims to fly a Black Hawk helicopter as it takes possession of U.S. arms, planes, and vehicles in Afghanistan. U.S. troops destroyed or disabled nearly 100 combat vehicles and dozens of aircraft before vacating the airport in Kabul on Monday in a last-ditch bid to deprive the Taliban of the use of some American military equipment. But now the U.S. forces have left. Now that the U.S. forces have left Afghanistan, defense officials, lawmakers, and experts who track the flow of weapons are watching closely to see what becomes of the acres of weaponry, vehicles, and aircraft that were left behind, are still operable, and can be of use to the Taliban or to arms smugglers. Jeez. Well, first we were told that all of the weaponry was inoperable. And now we're seeing and reading that, no, actually, just a little bit of it was inoperable. Most of it works quite fine. Oryx, a blog that verifies military equipment using photos and videos, has identified 38 airplanes. Jesus, 38 airplanes, 13 helicopters, and 7 unmanned aerial vehicles that the Taliban has captured in working order. The total stockpile is probably larger. The Taliban inherited thousands of U.S. supplied assault weapons and military ground vehicles, along with the other technology and equipment, including artillery pieces and night vision goggles and another toll of the U.S. troop withdrawal and the collapse of the U.S.-backed Afghan National Security Forces. This week, videos and photographs circulated on social media showing a U.S. UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter flying in Afghanistan, the first such images hinting at new Taliban combat air capabilities. How did the Taliban learn how to fly a Black Hawk helicopter? I'm just saying, Oh, boy. And that, by the way, podcast listeners, gets to really kind of what I was saying about this issue a couple of podcasts ago. It is no accident that we left this equipment behind. It's no accident. And you want to know why it's no accident that we left this equipment behind? Because we want and we intended to fully arm the Taliban. So why would we fully arm the Taliban? By we, I'm talking about the Biden administration. Because the Biden administration wanted someone to fill the power vacuum of the United States leaving. The United States leaves the United States leaves Afghanistan. There's a power vacuum. Power vacuum is such that when you have a major power leave, there's a vacuum. Who's going to fill that vacuum? What government is going to govern? Well, obviously it's not going to be the government that we'd installed. Or is it the government that we are installing? Is the Taliban really indeed the government that we intended to install to begin with? By we, I'm talking about Joseph Biden and his military experts and the CIA and the State Department. And I think the answer is yes. I think the United States of America under Joe Biden fully intended to not only turn over Afghanistan to the Taliban, but I think they fully intended to arm the Taliban, to fill the power vacuum left by the United States. And why do I think that? Well, because now we suddenly see the Taliban is making use of some of this equipment, including some of the most sophisticated equipment like Black Hawk helicopters. They can apparently fly them. Not all the Taliban, but some can. And if you leave $83 billion worth of weapons in Afghanistan, and those weapons were made in the USA, and they're left behind for the Taliban, doesn't that make the Taliban somewhat dependent on the United States for parts for those military supplies and those armaments? Doesn't it make the Taliban also dependent upon the United States for ammo for all of those armaments? Doesn't it make the Taliban dependent upon the United States for upgrades to those armaments and training on how to use those armaments? Doesn't the Taliban now kind of need the U.S. for some of these things? And I think the answer is yes. That's why I think it was intentional. It was absolutely intentional that when the power vacuum was caused by us leaving, that we intended for the Taliban to take over, and that we intended to leave $83 billion worth of equipment behind, and that we intended to make the Taliban somewhat dependent upon us so that we had something to trade with them on the long-term basis. They already have the $83 billion worth of equipment, but they're going to need training, they're going to need armaments, they're going to need replacement parts and so forth on an ongoing basis to be able to utilize that equipment over the long term, which means it gives us something to trade with the Taliban. And so why did we do it? Why did the Biden administration do it? And I have to underscore this to the podcast listeners. This isn't my idea of a good idea. This is the Biden administration's idea of a good idea. I'm just giving you the information as I see it because it just seems too obvious that we just handed this over to the Taliban, and that wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. We did it because we didn't want China to fill the power vacuum. We didn't want Russia to fill the power vacuum or to have more influence. And of course, Afghanistan abuts Iran. We don't want Iran to fill the power void. We don't want our adversaries filling the power void. So you might say, well, the Taliban's an adversary. Yeah, of course the Taliban's an adversary. But you know what the Taliban hates more than anything else? Foreign countries trying to invade them and occupy them. And that would be something that Russia has already done under the Soviet Union. And that's something that China would certainly, I think, consider, at least try to get a foothold into Afghanistan for economic purposes. I mean, they're already there for that reason. But certainly, why wouldn't they want some sort of military buildup there as well? But the Taliban isn't going to allow it. And since to the extent that the Taliban is now somewhat dependent upon the United States for repairing these armaments over the long term and providing them the ammo that they would need to use the armaments and training that they would need, I think it's pretty straightforward. This was all intentional. It was part of the plan. And this is what I think drives me crazy, okay? Because we should have been out of Afghanistan in 2011 when we killed Osama bin Laden. Once Osama bin Laden was killed, and granted he was killed in Pakistan, but much of the intelligence came from the Afghanistan as well as in Pakistan and other places to determine where he was. But once that happened, that's when we should have gotten the heck out of Afghanistan. But we didn't. And so fast forward 2021, the Biden administration's plan was big power vacuum. We leave. Who's going to fill it? Don't want the Chinese to fill it. Don't want the Russians to fill it. Let's get our old enemy, the ruthless Taliban, because if the Chinese try to mess with them, the Taliban is going to be fighting them with American equipment. And the American equipment is going to need to be repaired and replaced. And they're going to need the ammo from the United States, so they're going to need us. Pretty remarkable theory. This is a theory that I had a week or so ago. And I think it's pretty obvious now that that's exactly what is happening. It's exactly what's happening. Because there could be no other explanation for a world military power like the United States leaving behind $83 billion worth of equipment and allowing their arch enemy, the Taliban, whom they defeated in Afghanistan, to take control again of Afghanistan after 20 years. I mean, it's just... So the Biden administration faces a crisis of confidence over Afghanistan, understandably based on a lot of the stuff that I just said, but also on, of course, the way it was handled, the way the extraction of Americans was handled, the way the retreat from Afghanistan was handled, because clearly it is a retreat. President Biden is facing a crisis of confidence in his ability to serve as commander-in-chief due to overwhelming negative fallout he is receiving over the botched Afghanistan withdrawal, which left 13 U.S. service members dead and Americans and Afghan allies stranded. Former defense officials, military leaders, and members of Congress on both sides of the aisle have criticized Biden for leaving Americans behind as the last U.S. C-17 plane took off from Kabul Monday night, despite the president's promise a week ago, if there are any American citizens left, we're going to stay until we get them out. Of course, another lie. And I think there's a lot more, obviously, that's going on behind the scenes here with the Biden administration and the CIA, because I think there are embedded interests in the U.S. government, strongly embedded interests, not just in the military, but also in the services like the NSA and the CIA, and the military-industrial complex, which profits from hiring contractors to provide services in Afghanistan. And just so you podcast listeners know, I'll bet you know someone. I know I do. I know a number of people who went to Afghanistan, not as soldiers, but they went to Afghanistan as contractors. They were working for a contractor who was providing maybe a food service. Maybe the contractor was providing, repair services for vehicles. I mean, imagine all the services that are necessary of contractors to be able to support our operations in Afghanistan, where there's like zero infrastructure. And so many of these contractors got phenomenally wealthy. Many of them are connected to members of the military. Many of themselves are former military officials. And I just wish we would look into this a little bit more, because I'm sure the military-industrial complex had no real interest in leaving Afghanistan. And so in as much as we have extricated ourselves from Afghanistan in a way that is not with honor, and in a way that is incredibly embarrassing and damaging to the United States of America, and that's all on Joe Biden's hands, the fact of the matter is we did need to get out, and we're out, thankfully. But now that we're out, I just want our podcast listeners to understand that it was the intent of the Biden administration from the very beginning to have the Taliban take control, not just of Kabul, but the entire country of Afghanistan, and also to take control of the $83 billion of equipment that we left behind for the sole purpose so that they would be somewhat dependent upon us, the United States, on an ongoing basis for training and for materials and for ammo to support that material and armaments that we left behind. So get this, podcast listeners. Gavin Newsom pays off voters in advance of the recall. If you're being recalled in an election, you're governor of a state, there's no better way to get people to vote for you than to pay them off. And with COVID and all of the COVID stimulus bills, and the fact that California, in addition to the COVID stimulus bills from the federal government, also has a large budget surplus, well, good old Gavin Newsom was like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make sure that I give everybody a check. And that way, that check shows up like right before the recall election, so people will vote for me. So under Cal Matters magazine, look up your Golden State stimulus amount. Yeah, that's the title. August 4th. Look up your Golden State stimulus amount. Now, you don't have this check yet, but you can look it up online about how much the check's going to be when it's finally cut. And it's going to be cut just right before the recall election. California is expanding its Golden State stimulus program for low-income households to middle-class families under a new budget that Governor Gavin Newsom signed Monday night. State lawmakers agreed to spend $8.1 billion to help out millions of working families. That comes out on top of, and in addition to, the $3.8 billion sent out earlier this year to low-income families, including undocumented workers, bringing the total package to $11.9 billion, unprecedented for any state, the most of any state. What does that mean for you? Generally, households earning up to $75,000 in adjusted gross income will qualify for some state stimulus. So you can make up to $75,000. You're still going to get a stimulus check. You're going to get it right before the recall election. The governor says it should cover 78% of California taxpayers and will benefit 2 out of 3 Californians. 78% of California taxpayers are going to be paid off with a stimulus check right before Gavin Newsom's recall election. You wonder why Democrats stay in charge in California? This is how. This is how they stay in charge at the federal level too. It's how they stay in charge in the states that are blue. You just keep paying off people and they look at that check and they're like, oh my gosh, Gavin Newsom signed my check. And oh, he just happens to be up for a recall election. I'm going to go vote for him because I got my little $300. Families with at least one child or other dependent will get an extra boost, of course, because, you're going to pay you extra if you got kids. And undocumented workers will get an assist too, since they were excluded from recent federal stimulus packages. That's right. You got to pay the people that were here illegally, because come on, they're going to vote too. The administration has clarified that only Californians with earned income from work in 2020 can qualify for the Golden State stimulus payments, leaving out elderly and disabled people who only receive income from programs like Social Security benefits, private pensions, or veterans benefits. This has sparked some confusion and frustration among that population, especially people receiving disability benefits through Social Security who are excluded from the payments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So here's the thing. If you live in California, in less than 2 weeks' time, there's going to be a recall election, and you're going to be getting a check from good old Gavin Newsom just in time before the recall election. And this could very well put him over the top. It could very well put him over the top as the winner in the recall election. I could see enough people saying, I'm not going to recall him because this is the guy that keeps paying me to do nothing. So I'm going to, hey, why not? And I want to be fair here. It says you had to file taxes in 2020. So you were working through 2020 to file tax returns. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you had to be working in 2020. You just had to file tax returns in 2020. And then you get the stimulus check. And this is the problem in America right now, because this is not the purpose of government. Yet Democrats have figured this out. They figured out that you can pay people with taxpayer money so that they show up at the polls and vote you in and will never vote you out. No matter how bad you are, as long as you keep giving them free stuff, they will keep voting you in. And this is a fundamental flaw, I think, in our system. And at a minimum, it should be prohibited prior to elections. So during an election year, and certainly during a recall, governors should be prohibited from passing legislation that hands out free money to people. I'm sorry, it shouldn't be permitted. Because these individuals in California, 78% of them are going to get a check. They're going to get a check right before the recall election. So get this, podcast listeners. Democrats support school choice? What? Democrats support school choice? Well, you'll never guess why. You'll never guess why. So Democrats apparently are supporting school choice. And the reason they are supporting school choice is because Democrats want there to be mask mandates in public schools. The vast majority of Democrats support mask mandates in K-12 education. That is to say that if you're in K-12 and your parents are Democrats, your Democrats support forcing everyone in that school to wear masks. Conversely, Republicans, a majority of Republicans, don't support the mandates. They support the choice. That is to say, if you are Republican and you have children who are in K-12 school, you support you choosing what is best for your children as to whether or not they should wear a mask or not. You don't think the government should force it or mandate it. Well, what's happening is in school districts where mask mandates aren't in place, Democrats are so upset that they're now saying that they want to pull their kids out and send them to a school that has mask mandates. And that's why they're for school choice. It's like, not because they want really good education for their kid. Well, it's not true. I'm sure they want a good education for their kid. But I think it's really interesting that with COVID, there's a new motivation by Democrats to support school choice. And apparently it's overwhelming in the Democrat electorate that they support the right to choose where to send their child and have the tax money for the schools follow them to whatever school they choose. And the primary reason for them wanting to send their kids to private school or some other school is the mask mandate. Namely, not that they're anti-mask, but they're pro-mask. I mean, it can't make this stuff up. So that actually opens up a great opportunity for Republicans, because if you're a Republican and you say to yourself, wow, there's an opportunity to actually have people go to private school, and all we have to do is just talk to the Democrat Party and talk to Democrats and have a frank discussion. Like, look, you want your kid to go to a pro-mask school? I want my kid to go to a school where they have the option of wearing a mask, but not the requirement. But we both share this one principle, and that is we should be able to choose which school our kid goes to. Let's work together and do that. Let's do that. There's an intersection of our interests here, and that intersection is that we, as parents, want to do what's best for our children. That's called school choice. So let's do it. Let's work together. And I have to say that governors who are Republicans in blue states, like my governor in the state of Maryland is a Republican in a very blue state in the state of Maryland. And he has had an opportunity to use federal stimulus monies. He's had an opportunity under the extraordinary powers that were given to him under COVID to sign executive orders and to encourage school choice and to encourage and use monies under the emergency to help people pay for school choice, to pay for private schools, to pay for alternative schools, and to really talk about this issue in a real complete way. Namely, if you're a Democrat, you want your kid to go to a school that's smaller and maybe safer because of COVID, you should have that right. And talk about those principles, which is, we're all saying the same thing, actually, that we want what's best for our children, and we want to decide that. But unfortunately, the Republican governors in blue states, where the teachers' unions control everything, haven't been willing to buck those unions. They haven't been willing to do that which is necessary, because it's more important to them to be popular, much more important for them to be popular than it is for them to take a stance on a fundamental issue, one that would truly change educational outcomes in their states, because they want to be liked. That's the most important thing. They want to be liked by the teachers union. They just want to be liked. They don't want there to be any controversy, because if there is, then, their popularity polls may go down. So it's an incredible lost opportunity for my governor and the governor of Maryland, who did nothing to promote school choice during COVID and hasn't used the bully pulpit to really talk about it, and to use his pen and to use federal stimulus monies and to use the Constitution in the state where everyone must receive an appropriate and free education. I'm sorry, for me, if my kids were in K-12 right now, it would not be appropriate for them to be wearing a mask all the time. That's my personal opinion, just so you know, podcast sisters. By the way, that's also my choice. I'm the parent. So I should get to do that. I should get to send my kids to the school that I think best fits them. And so should you. If you're on the other side of this issue and you're like, no, I want my kids to wear a mask and I want everyone around them to wear a mask, you should have that right too. But my governor and the governors of many blue state governors who are Republicans, and there are several of them out there, they've really bungled this opportunity. And it was an opportunity to actually take what I believe is the civil rights issue of our time, and that is the right to send your child to any school that you want your child to go to and have those educational dollars follow them. So, podcast listeners, I was going to bring up an issue here, and I still will. It's in the WSJ. It's entitled, Imagine a Future Without Sex. Yeah, that's what that's the title. Reproductive technology may lead us to realize too late that being human is better than being God. Yet, the fact of the matter is that reproductive technology today allows us to do things such as create a designer human as a kid. So, if you could raise your infant's IQ by 4 points, would you? Many parents would, and it's now technologically feasible and possible. Geneticists can screen embryos for traits ranging from height to facial features to intelligence. The method builds upon the procedure of in vitro fertilization, which induces the release of several eggs by hormonal treatment and fertilizes them in a lab. Genetic testing of the resulting embryos can produce productions of the traits that the offsprings are likely to exhibit, even if those traits are polygenic, which means influenced by thousands of genes with tiny effects. The parents then choose an embryo to implant in the mother. IVF is common, which is in vitro fertilization, accounting for 10% of births in some countries. All this creates unprecedented ethical challenges in the immediate future. Consider parents who use IVF to raise their children's IQ. Yeah. Oh boy. If the children repeat that process for another generation, so let's say you go to IVF, which is in vitro fertilization, and you do it solely for the purpose of having a 6'2" baby, a boy that will eventually grow to 6'2" tall, whose IQ will improve by 4 percentage points. And then you repeat that process with that kid. When that kid's old enough, he does the same thing. Then this intergenerational designer baby thing increases IQ by north of 10 points, which is a humongous gain, by the way. That advantage could be big enough to give the grandchildren radically disproportionate representation at the highest levels of science, finance, information technology, medicine, law, and business. The other thing, too, is IVF, in vitro fertilization, is expensive. It costs $11,000 to $12,000 to do it. So it's really an upper middle class American and rich American thing that happens, right? Because generally speaking, you're paying for it out of pocket. This is not an insurance thing, especially if you're looking for the designer baby. And if you're upper middle class, you can write that check. If you're rich, you can write that check. So you actually could create something that is very unequal in society, that is not being created naturally, but rather is being created by designer babies. And it's pretty interesting article. It's definitely worth reading. And it definitely brings up the age-old issue, which is who should play God. And increasingly, because of technological advancements, parents can increasingly play God because they can determine through in vitro fertilization how tall their child is, the facial features of the child, the color of the hair, color of the eyes, and improved IQ that is significant to help them get into those great universities. Give me a break. Next up, podcast listeners, we have the dumbest bill in America. And do we have a lead up, Mr. Producer?
Of course.
Here it is.
Dum 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 dum.
And it's the dumbest bill in America, and it is paying criminals not to shoot people. You heard that correctly. Paying criminals not to shoot people, aka cash for criminals. Of course, it's in San Francisco, and it's under the Dream Keeper Fellowship. Well, don't take my word for it. Here's ABC News 7 in San Francisco reporting. We have a clip, and here it is.
Listen to this. A pilot program in San Francisco will incentivize people not to commit crimes by paying them a stipend. As ABC 7 News reporter Melanie Woodrow explains, the program isn't without controversy.
The San Francisco Dreamkeeper Fellowship is expected to launch in October. The pilot program will initially pay 10 at-risk for violence participants $300 a month to act as public safety ambassadors. If they meet certain milestones, they'll be eligible for as much as $500 a month. Cheryl Davis is the executive director of the San Francisco Human Rights Commission.
They are expected to do some conversations around public safety, to do some goal setting for themselves, to also think about how they can influence and impact their communities to be better.
Yeah, the goal setting. The goal setting is, well, you know, Johnny, you shot and killed that guy last year. We're going to pay you $300 not to shoot anyone, but we're going to give you $300 a month. You know? I think it's $300 a month. And I don't think it's $300 a week. I think $300 a month sounds about right. That's San Francisco, and that's ABC News San Francisco. We're going to give you, Johnny, $300 a month for not shooting anyone. Great job, Johnny. This month you didn't shoot anyone. Here's $300. So what could go wrong? Oh, well, ABC News 7 in San Francisco, that same report. Here's what could go wrong. We have that clip, and here it is.
David Mohammed, executive director of the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform, says Operation Peacemaker Fellowship, a program of the Richmond Office of Neighborhood Safety, was massively successful.
There was a 70% reductions in shootings and homicides in Richmond.
But the Office of Neighborhood Safety was not without controversy. One member was arrested and later sentenced to 40 years to life for shooting and killing Javante Prothro, whose mother spoke to ABC 7 News in 2016.
You didn't take their guns. You were giving them money to buy more guns.
So that mother lost her son because the criminal who shot and killed her son was part of the Cash for Criminals program, where he was being paid as a criminal not to shoot people. But instead, he used the $300 to buy a better gun. Can't make this stuff up. How does California survive with these idiot progressives who are running the state and running the cities? They're like at every level of government. It's almost like a disease. And so this poor mom lost her son because the Cash for Criminals program, namely paying criminals not to shoot people, didn't work. And, it's funny when, funny strains, by the way, that when a program like this doesn't work, someone dies. It's pretty important. Yeah, it's not like most programs where, you pay them and they don't go to work. No, not this. This is paying them and they actually kill people. So I think we should have San Francisco extend this to other areas. So in San Francisco, there's a problem with people living on the street and pooping on the street so bad that there's the poop patrol in San Francisco. This is actually a thing. People that are hired by the city and they've got these power sprayers and vans and they drive up to, these tenement camps outside. And there's poop all over the sidewalk and the street, and they just like power spray it off, and then wash it down the drain. At least I presume. It's disgusting because it's going to end up in a waterway. But hey, who am I to judge California's brilliance? They're really pro-environment there. So they're going to have cash for criminals. So why not cash for poopers, right? Here, sir, here's $300 a month if you don't poop on the street. And how about the drug? The stoners, right? The people that are doing drugs, a lot of these same people who are pooping on the street are drug addicts. Let's face it, they are, because California has legalized everything under the sun. And that's really gone well for the state because you have all these people that are drug addicts. They live on the street because they're stoned all the time with every kind of drug imaginable to mankind. So not just cash for criminals and not just cash for poopers, but cash for stoners, right? Sir, if you stay sober, we're going to give you $300 a month. It's like, oh, thanks, dude. I'm going to use that to buy my next weed. Yeah. So, that's going to happen. So paying criminals not to shoot people. So let's read what the San Francisco Examiner has said. It says a local solution, and this is this week, right? So this is a new article. A local solution for gun violence, paying people $300 a month. We are trying to address the root causes of what's happened. San Francisco thinks it may have an answer for its rising gun violence problem, paying people not to pull the trigger. Here's an idea. Why don't you tell the person who pulled the trigger that they should pay the person that they shot? The idea is to provide the small number of San Franciscans who authorities believe are most at risk of shooting someone or being shot with an incentive to help pay and stay out of trouble. It's a solution that proponents say already has shown promise preventing gun crimes in other parts of California. At worst, the program could be cash for criminals like its predecessors in cities around the Bay Area, who've also implemented the program. At best, it could save lives and tax dollars, otherwise spent on incarceration. No, actually, at worst, it could result in people dying, which has already happened with the Cash for Criminals program. At best, the taxpayers are going to have less money in their pockets because you're paying these idiots instead of making them pay for their crimes. You're paying them and rewarding them after they commit the crime. So who wouldn't do that? It's like, here's an idea. We're going to do Cash for Criminals, and then you get a gun, and you intentionally miss someone and shoot them, and you show up and go, hey, look, I'd like to sign up for the Cash for Criminals program and get $300 a month. And you really weren't a criminal to begin with, but you're getting $300 a month. And you easily pass the program. The program, which will launch as a pilot in October, is called the Dream Keeper Fellowship. It's San Francisco's latest iteration of a guaranteed income program that will provide high-risk individuals with $300 a month, just as a start, of course. Participants will be able to earn up to $200 more a month by hitting milestones in the program, such as landing a job interview, complying with probation, or consistently meeting with a mentor, so you can get $500 a month for not shooting people. The initiative will pair participants with newly hired life coaches from the Street Violence Intervention Program, known as SVIP, who will help them make the right choices and access services. The theory is that up to $500 stipend will serve as an incentive to participate and stay engaged. We know that $500 in San Francisco is not a significant amount of money, said Cheryl Davis, a proponent of the program and executive director of Human Rights Commission. But if it's enough to get you in to talk to folks and be able to make a plan for your life, then it's huge. Another guaranteed income situation? This isn't the first time a city has tried to reduce gun violence by offering cash. A similar anti-violence program in Oakland, California, for instance, offers young adults up to $300 for achieving milestones. What's new in San Francisco would start people off with a basic income of $300 a month. Ooh, without even having to meet any marks. So San Francisco's $300 is something that you get just by not shooting someone and stopping shooting people, but you don't actually have to meet any milestones to get the $300. I mean, you want to know why people are leaving California? Because the California nutty, idiot, crazy, out of their mind politicians throughout California, all the lefties, are passing bills like paying criminals not to shoot people and cash for criminals. And that is the dumbest bill in America. And that's it from Mark and the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Parler, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.